So this session is focusing on an introduction on digital preservation, what it is, especially in the context of libraries and archives, how it is useful, and how it helps inform the future practices of archives. I've left time for questions at the end, but if anyone who's joining us virtually wants to pop questions in the chat as they creep up or come to you, feel free to do that, but we will go over them at the end. It never fails to not advance at first. One second, everyone. Okay, sorry about that. Always something fun with technical difficulties. So I wanted to start off today just by quickly introducing myself. So those of you who don't know me, I'm Juliana Milburn. I'm the University Archivist here at UB. And just a bit of my quick background. I have a Master's of Library and Information Science with a focus in Archives and Records Management from the University of Denver. I've been in the field for about 10 years. I first worked in digitization as a student in undergrad and graduate school, both actually. And then I have a digital archives specialist certification, which is from the Society of American Archivists, which is the biggest American professional group of archivists. And I joined UB in January of this year after working for 6 years in geospatial engineering services at the University of Virginia. So before we get fully into digital preservation, I think it's helpful to first cover what like plain, if you will, preservation is. So preservation is the professional discipline of protecting materials by minimizing chemical and physical deterioration and damage to minimize the loss of information and to extend the life of cultural property. And I took that definition from the SAA dictionary because it's much more eloquent than me trying to come up with my own. But important factors of preservation is that it's first important because it's ensuring that the longevity of information will serve to enrich future knowledge. So organic materials always deteriorate. Depending on what they're made up of, though, it'll be at different rates of deterioration, and information that they contain can be vital. So it's important to know what different timelines and risk factors you have with materials that you are in custody of. So especially like knowing the specific risk factors associated with their chemical and physical deterioration. So it's important to know all of these different risk factors so that you can prioritize what may need immediate attention versus what is okay to do less intervention on for a while. So all records need to have their environment considered, and a lot of environmental concerns have to do with temperature, dust, pests, the level of UV light or absence of UV light, how they're handled, and then more natural things that you can't always avoid, but you can put measures in to protect, like fire, water, and then bit rot is a big one that is essential for digital information, and we will talk a little bit more about that. So in some cases with materials that are of lasting value that are not in great shape, digitization can be used as a way to preserve the information on those and to increase their access by, but also decreasing any physical handling of them. So digitization as a means of preservation is different than what we're talking about today, which is actual digital preservation. So while they're made up of the same words, the combination is a little bit important, and there's a slight difference between them. So digital preservation is the management and protection of digital information to ensure authenticity, integrity, reliability, and long-term accessibility. So digital preservation represents the utilization of management activities, strategies, best practices and standards, and policies and procedures to guarantee ongoing access to both digitized and born digital information. So if that seems long-winded, it's because digital preservation it's huge. It's a huge umbrella encompassing a lot of things that go into it. So this guarantee of ongoing access is despite the challenges and the technological change that is happening, I think we've all seen rapidly. So digital preservation efforts seek to provide accurate and authentic rendering of content while ensuring that its future functionality and usability exists over time. So first, we'll cover a little bit of what digital information is. So digital information is a sequence of binary digits or bits that are encoded onto a physical storage medium. So the binary is zeros and ones, and all of those zeros and ones that are bits, the pattern that they are in makes up your bit stream. So a sequence of them is called a bit stream, but individually they're bits. And then I'm pretty sure if you have like two, they're called bytes, just to make it super confusing. But bit streams are not human readable or understandable in the way that, like, sure, you can read zeros and ones, but it's not going to mean anything to you. It's which is why we encode or write them onto hardware to be rendered by software to be human usable information. So hardware is your physical container that houses essentially disks or a physical medium where bits will be encoded if it's not a disk. So it's the CPU unit of your computer, although they also refer to your monitor and your keyboard as hardware. You know, it's your laptop, it's your external hard drive. Hardware can also, as I said, hardware can also be used for monitors and any other pieces to make, that are necessary to make the machine usable to humans. But inside your CPU, your laptop, your external hard drive, there is a physical disk, and it looks a little bit like this picture here. So this disk is able to have bit streams physically marked on it and stored into what are called sectors. So if you can see between two lines, those are, I'm pretty sure, representing sectors, and you're able to encode different bit streams into different sectors within the disk. So software, though, allows you to command your hardware to be able to render or retrieve bit streams in order to make them human usable. It also allows you to interact with bit streams in a human usable way and carry out different functions. So like when you open your document in Microsoft Word and you're editing it and then you save it, what's happening behind there is your computer is recalling down bit streams and showing it to you in the software format that makes it usable for you. And then when you save, it's going to rewrite or maybe write again the information, the new things that have changed, the new bit streams onto the media so that it can come back again. So this last point is that there is a difference between digitized and born, or digital information contains both digitized and born digital information. So digitized information is something that existed in an analog format. It's a piece of paper that you scan and to get that information into a digital format. And then born digital information is what we create almost every day, all the time. You know, it's all of your things that start out on a computer. So all of your new Word documents, your emails, your Excel spreadsheets. Yeah. Okay. So digital preservation framework can get a little bit nebulous if there's so much documentation, which is a wonderful thing to have. But digital preservation, digital stewardship, and digital curation are all very related. So this is actually the digital curation life cycle from the DCC, and I like it the best to try and visualize like exactly how much digital preservation entails. So in digital preservation, it's made up of best practices and standards, strategies, and policies and procedures. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's a fairly robust framework that you have to have set up in order to do digital preservation. So with this life cycle, you can see that in data, like data itself, so this is in the middle, the very like middle orange circle, there are digital objects and digital databases. So digital objects, oh yeah, yes. I'll try and read as many words as I can for you so you don't have to squint. Yeah, so digital objects are stored in databases, but databases themselves also need to be considered with digital preservation. So in the full life cycle, there's description and representation information. There's also preservation planning. There's community watch and participation, which is related to access and people being to access your digital information. And then there's curation and curate and preserve. So that's the full life cycle. That's kind of like what is happening all of the time. Sequential actions are to conceptualize, to create or receive, appraise and select, ingest, which means actually getting the digital information or the digital objects like to an archives or a library so that digital preservation can happen. Preservation actions, store, access, use and receive, reuse, and transform. So those are actions that like fall more in a step. So if you're looking at a workflow of what a library or an archives are doing, like those are the actions that you can kind of like map when they happen. And then the full life cycle are actions that are kind of always happening. As you can see, I think that's why I like this, the sphere. So you can see how many things are happening kind of all the time. So curate and preserve, like those are happening all of the time. And then occasional actions, if there's any disposition, so disposing, reappraising, if your mission changes or maybe something was accepted a long time ago that no longer fits your collecting mission of the university, or not of the university, sorry, of the institution. And any migration. So if you're moving systems, if you're having to migrate formats because there's been a technological advance and this file format is no longer stable, that kind of thing. So those are occasional actions. So those might not be happening all the time. Okay, so we went over the framework briefly of digital preservation, but then why is it important and how is it useful? So I always like to frame this, and it's not just me, I guess. I've read a lot of papers that frame this and it makes sense for my brain, but it's making the case for digital preservation. So like pretending you have to go to a decision maker or your boss or someone and be like, we should do this, and here's why. I think it's helpful in practice to do that with a lot of things. So for digital preservation, it helps with collection development. Because a lot of the standards in place for digital preservation require for policies to be created, and having clear collection development is essential to making sure that you are being good stewards of what you have, and being very clear on what it is you can do well in collecting and what maybe someone else might be a better option for, or like if certain things are candidates for collecting. It ensures that corporate memory is preserved. So I think we're all aware now that in institutions in, almost what, 2023 now, there's a lot that's happening that's born digital content. And if there's not digital preservation plans put in place for that born digital content, that's how Institutions are recording their decisions. That's how things are being done now. That's business. And so if you are not making sure to have a plan of digital preservation, you're losing corporate memory, which means you're affecting decision making in the future or just information that's essential for people to carry out business functions. User access, digital preservation can aid in increasing user access. So if you ensure that your digital objects are being preserved well and you have your standards, your strategies, and your policies all set in place, it makes the user experience and takes down a lot of barriers of user access just naturally, in that a lot of users are seeking out this information digitally. And so you are meeting them where they already are, and it can increase your user base. So information reuse is super helpful. I think I definitely love the phrase of like not reinventing the wheel. And I think that's very important for both time and honestly, like you see a dollar efficiency in this as well. If people are able to reuse information they're not redoing work that has already been done to achieve the same mission. And a further efficiency of that means that you're not having people within any institution or corporation who are maybe working on the exact same thing but don't know it because they're not sharing resources or information with one another. So reputational protection, it protects you because you're being transparent and you a lot of times are doing the proper regulatory measures that you need to be doing, which plays into the next point. So like a lot of times there are legal and regulatory compliance measures to this as far as what information corporations have and what they're doing with it. So you can save yourself a lot of headaches and trouble if you do digital preservation work correctly and are not through purposeful actions or not protecting information in the way that you're supposed to, or keeping track of different digital assets. So it helps in continuity because that means that with access increase, it's not just either on a drive on a shelf somewhere where no one has access to it, or it's not on like one person's computer, not correctly in whatever digital preservation workflow you have. So that obviously protects investment, especially since technology is expensive, server space is expensive, but you want to utilize it in the best way and most efficient way possible. Plus, a lot of the information that you have in digital objects might be vital. So by not having those properly preserved, that's not protecting your investment of that information. So a huge one that we're all aware of now after going through pandemic times, supporting digital ways of working, which is more relevant now than ever. So this article that I based a lot of these off of is from 2014, and that was already a thing mentioned in there. And now I think it's become even more and more relevant. Like institutions need to support digital ways of working because that's how people are working. That's how users are retrieving, and like you can't go back to analog necessarily. So it rationalizes data storage and implementing shared services. So you can actually see a cost, like this could actually protect investment too, because if you have a good plan like this and you have the strategies in place, then a lot of those cloud services or something that you're using for overall IT, like this can incorporate into them and actually protect a lot of like loss of information that people may not be thinking of. So challenges of digital preservation. This three-legged stool is a very, very popular thing. Pretty much everything in the digital preservation world for like libraries and archives, at least, uses this three-legged stool, and it's from it's an iteration of a document that it comes from, but like from Kenny and McGovern. I think it first popped up in 2015. It was super hard to find what the first publication date is, but the three-legged stool shows all three legs of challenges of digital preservation. So almost all of the challenges fit into one of these three branches. So technology, organization, and resources. So technology, obviously, technology changes. You have technological changes. It's changing at a very fast rate. As we get more of it, it continues to change faster. Media deterioration, as I said, all organic materials deteriorate. So even if you have an amazing fancy laptop, like it will deteriorate at some point. There's also hardware and software obsolescence. So, I mean, maybe I'll just, if anyone in here ever used Word Perfect, you don't have to raise your hand. You don't have to claim that that's what you started out on. But, on a standard computer, like on this nice computer right here in front of me, if I tried to open a Word Perfect file, I probably would not get full information or all information. And then also with software obsolescence, there's also planned obsolescence from proprietary software companies where they actually, because they want you to continue to subscribe to their software, they do not make backwards compatibility. So sometimes the obsolescence can be it can be planned for businesses to make sure that they have income. Which I guess is my next thing. So proprietary formats. There are a lot of formats that are standards. In fact, PDF started as a super, or not started, but Adobe took over PDF for a long time and kind of had it be a proprietary format. And then other softwares had to use it. So, and maybe that's not quite as true on PDF as other things that they have done, but big companies like that, where you see the names all the time, or even just, Microsoft Word finally had backwards compatibility, I think in, 90, it wasn't 98. I think it was the next XP maybe, where you could finally save it. Yeah. So like there used to be a huge problem depending on if you were a Mac user versus a PC user on like word processing softwares, and how like they could not possibly be compatible with one another.
And they're achieving more. Windows 11, they want to be the center of everything, combining competitors.
Yeah. So DocX, I remember that coming out, and that made it so that it's more compatible than their previous versions. So the next stool kind of is, I guess, like this falls into organization, but it's resources allocated to digital preservation. So that's a challenge of it. If it's not a priority for the institution, then obviously budget, staffing, all of those become an issue. And it cannot be a priority because it's harder to get on the radar sometimes of people. Like generally people get on track with proper record keeping and digital preservation practices through being burned. So sometimes it's hard to make the case preemptively, because it does take significant resources to allocate and do it well. There's also the issue of human error. I think we've all accidentally like not realized we had a file picked up on our mouse and just like completely, unclicked and thrown that file somewhere. So you can imagine what can happen sometimes with digital preservation practices, just through being a human. And then there's also intentional harm. So there is intentional harm out there with digital information, either through someone trying to change the information, get rid of the information, have different accesses to systems. So there is some intentional harm over there, but the majority of errors that are made are actually human errors, not intentional, as far as the rates go. So digital preservation in libraries and archives specifically. So it's not as new or recent of a topic as many assume it to be. It's been a focus of publications within the library and archival field since the 1990s. I didn't try and look back earlier than that, but I know I've seen a bunch from that era. So it's not something that the field is just now thinking of, or it's not in reaction to certain current events. It's been something that people are very aware of in the field. So best practices, standards, strategies, metadata schemas exist, and policy examples are widely available. So the resources on digital preservation within the field are abundant, robust, and many institutions globally participate in digital preservation activities share almost all of their documentation, if not all of it, which is wonderful. Many different software to aid in workflows or practices, and most of them are open source. So most of the notable and recognizable software in digital preservation workflows in archives and libraries started with a grant or with institutional funding and were developed with archivists and librarians. So they are very committed to being open source software. Which means that they are subscription free. You do not have to pay to have access to the software. And they're committed to that in order to support the work that is being done. So Curation, which is a digital forensic software, which is one that I'm just very familiar with, it started in funding. It started with funding in 2016 and was a Mellon Foundation grant. And now Curation is like the one digital forensic software for archives and libraries that, I mean, all of my training was using Curation. So, and then there are certification programs like DAS, so Digital Archive Specialists. I'm not sure if ICA, which is the International Council, has one similar, but there are certifications available. So the Digital Archive Specialist certification is from the Society of American Archivists, and it's a 9-course certification. So you have to take 9 courses and pass all of your examinations. And then there's a final examination. And I'm pretty sure it's a 5-year certification. So continued with libraries and archives specific. This is the simplified OAIS model. So OAIS is the Open Archival Information System, and it is now an ISO standard. So it's now ISO standard 14721, which is internationally recognized standards. So this is it, folks. So this was developed for use in facilitating a broad discipline independent consensus on requirements for an archive or repository to provide long-term preservation of digital information. So it was also intended to support the development of additional digital preservation standards, which they went through ISO certification, which is awesome. So they are living out their mission. So if you're studying digital preservation, like this is what you study, but you study the more complicated version. So this is the framework where you will be spending your time if you're studying digital preservation. You'll get very familiar with your SIPs, APEs, and DIPs. So your SIPs are the submission information package, your APEs are your archival information package, and your DIPs are your dissemination information packages. And I've included just a few things to touch on to not overwhelm with information. But for ingest, which you can see if you go all the way to the beginning of the diagram, in the blue box, it says ingest. So that's coming in with your submission information. On ingest, a lot of times, the workflows for our libraries and archives can include digital forensics, and that's not like CSI forensics. There's no kind of like DNA looking, but digital forensics in a lesser form than what like a federal bureau would use to solve crimes or something. It's looking to see if you can find what information is housed and if there's any that's missing. And so a lot of times that's achieved through taking disk images, which is taking a capture of all of the information that is on someone's disk. Then in the data management sphere, there's PREMIS, which is a metadata standard. It's the international standard of metadata to support the preservation of digital objects and ensure their long-term usability. So it was developed by an international team of experts. So Premise is implemented in digital preservation projects around the world, which means that its usability is awesome since it's used internationally. It's not just specific to certain regions or countries. Support for Premise is incorporated into a number of commercial and open source digital preservation tools and systems. So some of the software that I was talking about in a previous slide, they have been configured to fully use Premise. So a lot of the fields, if you're using that software to enter metadata, it'll already have pre-populated different Premise fields for you to fill in the metadata on your digital objects. So an example I think that's helpful with Premise and maybe how it differs from some other metadata that you might be familiar with is that it focuses a lot on both like what preservation activities a person has undertaken on digital objects, but it also includes like way more technical metadata. So name with full extension of the file, which is not something that is always included. The size in bytes, which is super helpful so that then you know how much storage you need to actually have. What format it is in the pronom PID. So pronom is, it's from the UK National Archives, they sponsor it, but it's the online registry of technical information. So it's the registry of file formats, of software products, and all of those. So they have a complete registry, or try to always have a complete registry of every file format information. So then you could look up all of your extensions in case you get a weird file that's like a .loc and you're like, I have no idea what that means or how to open that. There are registries available that give you that information. Another example of technical metadata would be like last modified date. And it's actually really important when you're ingesting that you use a write blocker so that you don't actually modify the last modified date as someone who's accepting the information. And then technical metadata might also include a checksum value and what type of checksum was run. So a checksum is, it runs like a computation, gives you back just a like number series. And then if you were to run it again over time and one of the numbers changed, it would tell you that something has changed within that file. So it doesn't tell you necessarily what has changed, but it'll tell you if something has changed. So this helps with fixity of files and at least monitoring that like maybe your system isn't doing something. So if you had opened something without a write blocker, your checksum value would change if you opened the file again. And then as far as storage, in like the storage realm of this OAIS model, there's what's called trusted digital repositories that I wanted to mention. So a trustworthy repository, to go through it, well, it's just changed now that they're an ISO standard, but I'm pretty sure you still use the TRAC checklist. So TRAC is Trustworthy Repositories Audit and Certification, and it's a criteria and checklist. It's also available online for you to just do a self audit on your systems to see maybe like what you haven't thought about or like how you're faring. You don't have to go through the exhaustive process of trying to become a trusted digital repository because that's not feasible for every institution. And then access, I put on here software as a service. So that's the common abbreviation for it, the capital S, AA, capital S. Software as a service is emulation with a virtual machine. So you have an ability to run older programs like your WordPerfect or past iterations possibly of software so that you're able to open files and render them in a way that makes sense instead of like if you're opening them and you just get an error and see all kinds of crazy boxes and half binary on it. So it can be used both in digital forensics practices. So like if you're trying to see what what you have and actually make the information usable, but it can also be a service, an access service for allowing users to both view and interact with materials that are in a format that they themselves don't have software with. So it can be an imperfect solution too in some cases for proprietary software companies who are not seeing the value in making their files backwards compatible, since they want new licenses and are not financially incentivized to make backwards compatibility. But a lot of times software as a service and using emulation will allow you to open, like older CAD files or something. So the future within archives, digital accessions will continue to increase of born digital information because that is the world that we are in. So much information is already starting out born digital, so it will continue to do that. Archives will continue to get hard drives and computers and things as accessions, not just what people think of as like manuscripts or anything. There will be more software as a service to help combat obsolescence, but also to serve access demands. So like I said, using it as an access service for your users to be able to emulate software. Institutions and businesses will need to follow record keeping best practices with their digital records in order to contribute to digital preservation successfully. So there needs to be institution and business buy-in in order to do this successfully, or else their digital information is not going to be able to be preserved, because there are certain things that need to be in place for you to actively participate in having proper digital preservation. So digital archivist positions will continue to be created. There are a lot more that exist. So a lot of bigger university institutions have digital archivists, especially if they have focus on like digital humanities programs or things like that. There are a lot of huge companies that have a digital archivist or two. There are also some smaller institutions that are having digital archivists because they have digital assets. Ad companies, for example, like they have large digital assets. They create ads, and so those positions will continue to be created. And then there will also be the continued development and expansion of metadata terms and recommended formats for both master files, which are files that you keep as your preservation master, you absolutely don't touch it, and then access files for your users to be able to access the information without changing the master. As technology continues to get updated, and recommendations for the most stable of formats for both of those things will continue to be updated. So, any questions?
Yes, excellent
Yes.
presentation. Actually, hearing some of the things that you covered in the presentation reminded me of a conversation that the president had, and he's very much interested in digitization. He's even mentioned it a couple of times in his remarks that, the university even needs more of a digital focus, and that will also help with accreditation, because when I guess when they did the evaluation, they discovered that there were a number of people that weren't around and had some files or documents been in a digital format, we would have fared better in the initial books. So my question to you is, what would you think would be the best injection or approach to a digital library, or to correspond with what we're doing right now?
So institutional wise, or just like library specific? Okay, because there's slightly a difference. So like as far as needing information to have like operation of the university as a whole, like that would be more of like a document management system, and like capital digital preservation doesn't necessarily need to be carried out in the same manner that I talked about here, because generally you would purchase that software, and some of them are actually Well, it depends on your price point. If they're stamped off by the ISO standard and are actually a trusted digital repository, but the needs are slightly different with that. So like that would be a document management system that like helps processes and things continue. But library specific, like a digital asset management system with capabilities for digital exhibition is a great start. And a lot of those systems already have set up different things like audit trails, like for you if you're using a system like that. But if you're still not having some kind of software lift with it, it's still good practice to just make sure that you are mitigating all that you can. So like when you're ingesting materials, not everyone has access to like what's being ingested, so people can't accidentally open a file that you're trying to bring into the institution. Making sure that you have data backups, that you have especially for like important information, that you have an access copy if researchers are going to be use that, and then you have a master copy that's in a different format. So there are things that you can do that are definitely scalable, depending on what size. But there is a difference between like archival and library resources digital preservation versus like institutional wide document management that feeds into processes, because digital preservation would kind of be both concurrent and on the end of that. And a lot of those systems have things in place that you can utilize for digital preservation. But like for meeting minutes, I don't think you would assign like premise metadata to them, just because it's a significant resource, time and like personnel staffing wise and things like that. And like you also want to make sure, in an archival world, we say MPLP, so like more product, less process. So you want to make sure to balance the time that you're spending with the return that you're going to get on it. So like your return on investment is important, especially for how many, like if we're using meeting minutes, like look at how many meeting minutes are created every single week. Like you would never be able to attach like a full template of premise metadata on them necessarily before you're just like, you just create a backlog for yourself. So yeah.
Thank you. Another follow-up question to that is, we know with what happened with Dorian, we had a library that was washed out to sea. And they are still trying to recover from the records that they lost. As a matter of fact, I think unless some people are able to prove it, document like some persons have no record that they were married, that they were divorced. And that's a serious thing. So my question to you is, and maybe putting on the head of broadcast and predictor, do you think we should be moving in the direction of being more digital versus print?
Yeah, so the interesting thing with digitization is, again, it takes considerable resources. So it should be pinpointed on things that are going to need to be retrieved. So you should not have the blanket case. Like so often people, when they're cleaning out their office or cleaning out your home or whatever, or maybe like family photos, you're like, oh, let's just digitize everything because that makes it wonderful. But if you're not being methodical about it, and you don't have identifiers for like how you're going to name, like a standard for how you're going to name file formats and everything, or it's not in a system where you can easily search and you're depending on the searching capabilities of like your PC, you're making things unusable. And it's also, digital clutter is a real thing. And while a lot of analog formats seem like they take up so much space and it'd be easier just to make it digital, like the digital rendering of it actually takes up way more space than a lot of people think of. So it should be intentional. But as far as records that absolutely will need to be accessed, like marriage records, property records, that type of thing, yes, absolutely. But I think that you need to have a plan of what it's going to do, not just like I'm going to run all of these through the scanner next to my desk and then have all of them have that label that's like scan today's date at this time, because then you have no idea what that is and it's actually not making it usable. And then for things that you know you're going to have access to, they need to be in a proper system. And part of disaster planning and part of, if you're going through track for trusted repository, you have to have file backups in different geographic locations. So we are susceptible to hurricanes here. If something is hitting here, like you don't want your backup to be like your only backup to be like in Florida, which is like probably also going to be impacted, or like it only have a tape backup physically on campus with us. So yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
In terms of the university and getting the resources in digital format, has consideration been given by, say, for example, board of trustee documents or things like student records, or what is the plan in terms of digitizing, I guess, the institution?
Right. So with UB Archive specifically here, we are not quite there yet because there's physical processing that needs to be done, like of the holdings, to get that sorted around and have actual like collections and series and know what we have and maybe know what we're missing, because I think that depending on who thought about it, we have some records of different, like, so Board of Trustees was your example. So like maybe we have some records of Board of Trustees from this year to this year because it's like when someone thought about it, but we might be missing a lot more. So what we're doing is formalizing and organizing what we physically have to try and understand what we have and maybe like what we do not have. But as far as digitizing, there are things that like if you work at a university long enough, you know that there are things that are going to be asked, and there's also, since we're an institutional and collecting archive, there are things that we might digitize that will serve university employees but won't necessarily be accessible to our outside researchers. So like student records is a perfect example in that those might be a high candidate for digitization and having access, and having in a digital asset management system, but the roles of people who would be able to access those digitally would be probably people who need to fulfill job requirements, because they have identifying information about students that is not like that wouldn't be open to an online exhibition on the web. But we are getting a digital asset management system, which will be used by the archives, but also is able to be used for the library. So if there are things that you're digitizing, even like journal articles or some kind of other resource that we're digitizing all the time to provide, like I know there are heavy hitter classes where like students need the same the same information to complete assignments like time and time again, but having it in a digital asset management system actually means that you can just like create a link or like give them access to the same scanned version, so you're not scanning it every single time someone needs it.
Right, because I was thinking like Antoinette mentioned earlier in terms of us being in hurricane zone.
Yeah.
We have so far most of our records are still in paper format.
Right.
I'm thinking, can it be done simultaneously where as you go through sorting, some scanning can be happening at the same time?
Yes. Yeah. But it just the time investment on that, like you just want to be very thoughtful on what you're digitizing and why. But my plan is definitely to have things scanned that are priority, and then any other requests that come in, like doing that at that time and continuing to fill so that you're not giving yourself like the crazy task of just being like, no, I have to scan everything. So making sure to save any of the work that we're doing in between that time period of getting to certain things. Yeah.
I guess it's a good backup question to what she, both Antoinette and Elsie was suggesting. Maybe we can go over some of the things that we've already began doing, like the preparation for the policies and the various manuals that we would be using. So sorry. And then also the collection development, because I think, as you mentioned, in order to for this to be facilitated properly, it has to be methodical. It has to, we have to have specific policies and procedures in place. So it's not an ad hoc thing where you can just, you know, do this and do that. Then there's going to be chaos. And so what Juliana has been doing is developing the policies. And we had a policy, but what you've begun doing is kind of dissecting it so that it ensures that we are taking care of what it is we need to take care of, as well as developing the archives for future collections and for future development.
And I think it makes sense that she says we want to go in order of
Right.
priority. You don't want to just
Exactly.
because
Yeah.
I think that something is important,
Right.
that you start
Right.
what you're
Right.
doing.
And-
Yeah,
Well, and there's,
it's a process to,
Yes.
you know, everything. So, but my thinking was just to, you know, in terms of just trying to see it get done or
Yeah.
some things are, and even in terms of equipment, I don't know, and software, I know there's nothing in place at the moment.
Right.
That we have. And have you thought about maybe seeking funding?
so we have funding for the digital asset management system to at least bring it on,
Okay.
and it should cover with the model that we're going. It's an open source software, but you pay a fee, like you pay a hosting fee essentially. So it's a fairly low cost, especially institution wise, but we have the funding to, I think, get us through 3 years, 2 to 3 years. So that is definitely in the works, and then that will be able, because you don't want to do too much scanning and digitizing before you have a system where those things are going to go, especially how we're set up now, because that would be taking considerable server space, or like you don't want to be in the situation either where someone's like storing it on their personal machine, because that is definitely susceptible to just having it be gone. But there's also a difference in digitization techniques on if it's for preservation and like what level of preservation. So institutional information, of course, would be like a little bit of a different level of preservation than like the one copy of some masterful artist's artwork. Yeah, so there's all kinds of different things with that too. So digitization is also not like as easy as just having someone run a bunch of things through a feeder scanner, because depending on the material, like you don't want to run it through the feeder scanner. You also really want to pay attention to what levels of DPI and all kinds of things like that. So yeah.
I noticed in your presentation, you talked about the digital archivist and that position becoming very prominent over the last, I would say last decade, I would say maybe last 20 years. Who would you say works closely with such a person, like digital archive team, what comprise of how, you know?
Oh, okay. So there's, yeah, so usually, well, I'll university wise. So like in a university, like we are, like if there is a digital archivist, they're usually housed within the library. And there's a lot of times a university archivist and then a digital archivist, because so much of this work, like that takes all of your time. But they usually have a combination of like maybe a processing archivist or 2. Student workers are amazing. Yeah, and that's part of what I did as a student worker. So like obviously shameless plug. But yeah, so a lot of it happens with student worker, just because of how, I mean, not news to any of us who are in the profession, but like, it's not like we get giant teams to do things a lot of times. So yeah, it's usually like a digital archivist, maybe like a processing archivist or 2, and then student workers from what I've seen. Yeah. And then generally when I've seen institutions that want a digital archivist, they generally already have or are looking to purchase an asset management system for what they do. And sometimes the digital archivist is by themselves. Sometimes they're under whatever hierarchy of the institution. Sometimes they're in the records department. Sometimes they're in the art department. So it kind of, it varies all over the place, but yeah. And a lot of times like digital archivists in those situations where they are helping maintain or create those systems, like they're coming up with like data dictionaries, they're creating metadata terms, they're creating thesauruses like that are pertinent to the different work that's happening there, like especially if it's within a certain field. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you see your department growing in order to facilitate what is needed for you? In terms of a department, a university should have a department that's large as what, or depends on the size of the university. Well, not size, department.
It depends on the size of the university. Yeah, funding is always the big one. But a lot of times at smaller institutions, it's really worth it to look into what systems, and like a lot of them are open source. So like that budget area is really, it's easy to hit and it's nicer to be in there because a lot of the tools, especially since they're developed in the digital preservation world by like archivists and librarians, like they're robust and great tools, and they're for that exact purpose, so that you can bring on a tool and really have it facilitate your work, and like you're not having to go to your institution being like, okay, now I need a system that's going to be $30,000 a year or something like that. And I might be way off on that price tag. I'm very bad at guesstimating. But they've tried to remove some of those budget barriers, staffing barriers, so that you're able to do the best that you can and have tools to help you get there. Yeah.
I know over the years, we've been trying to get to university, and there's been a lot of changes, a lot of new things come along, new ideas come along. People, it's like you start and someone else come on, you start something else different.
Mhm.
So what you're putting in place now should more or less be something that's going to be a continuous process, because it's laying the foundation.
Yes, which is why, that's why I've been so focused on policies, procedures, like a processing manual, trying to lay out all of the documentation that you absolutely need as the foundation before you start any of this work. Because yeah, and some of the things that have already occurred within the archives at like different time periods, it has been without a full foundation below it, which makes it harder to try and come in and make like a holistic picture. But that foundation being laid is essential, and like having all of that documentation is absolutely step one before you do any kind of processing. So yeah, in current state, we're not going to have like a perfect, robust digital preservation like workflow here right away, also because most of the things that I have currently are analog, but it's definitely on the horizon. And especially with like, if you think of presidential records or any VPs, like they're making born digital content every single day. So like it is something to be aware of, but it's definitely a walk before you run process as far as getting policies, procedures all down. Yeah.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thanks. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us.